The mess hall buzzed with casual noise, cutlery tapping trays, boots scuffing against linoleum, a few loud bursts of laughter from the officer's table near the back wall. I moved slowly between rows of tables, the coffee pot steady in my hand. The apron tied at my waist was clean but stained at the hem. White pants, navy top, no rank, no insignia. Just another cafeteria worker. Or so they thought. You in the army? One lieutenant chuckled as I passed. You're not even wearing a uniform. Another leaned in. Thanks? For the coffee. I nodded without a word. When will women stop pretending to be soldiers? Someone muttered, just loud enough for the words to carry but quiet enough to avoid responsibility. I heard it all. I always did. But I kept pouring coffee, nodding politely and moving on. These boys like to pretend their eyes told them the whole story. Then the phone in my pocket vibrated. A specific tone, sharp, mechanical. I pulled it out. The screen glowed. Pentagon, urgent. I set the coffee pot down. The voices kept laughing, oblivious. I answered, turning away slightly from the tables. General Harper. Silence. Then, clear the room. We have a situation. I turned back. Clear the room, I repeated, louder now. We have a situation. The air shifted. A pause stretched over the mess hall like a held breath. Forks stilled. One by one heads turned. Major Williams stood near the condiment station. His brow furrowed. Wait. General Harper? Harper from the Ghazni convoy. I didn't answer. I was already moving to the far end of the room, pulling a tablet from my apron pocket, fingers gliding across the screen. Someone whispered, Ghazni? That's the op where, wait, what? Williams froze. She pulled survivors under RPG fire, he murmured to no one. I was already issuing orders. Secure lines only. Get me live feeds. And alert NATO. DEFCON 3. Colonel Denton, Travis Denton, stood at the head of the officer's table. His face went pale, the color draining in real time. Only 10 minutes earlier, he'd looked me over like I was a joke. A woman in a kitchen. Now he didn't know where to put his eyes. The silence held for another beat, thick and stunned. I'm Lieutenant General Evelyn Harper, I said evenly. I've been here under observation. You may now return to your coffee. They didn't return to their coffee. Not right away. It was like watching a building realize it had no foundation, men in crisp uniforms suddenly unsure of their place, their rank, their assumptions. Some of them stood, awkwardly half saluting before stopping themselves. Others sat frozen, cups halfway to their lips. Denton looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. Major Williams was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, eyes on me, then glanced at the others. Stand down, he said quietly, but his voice cut the air like a clean blade. She outranks everyone in this room. I didn't flinch. My fingers were already gliding across the tablet. Data streamed in, satellite overlays, field reports, personnel manifests. DEFCON 3 confirmed, came a voice through my earpiece. NATO command online in 7 minutes. First recon squadrons deploying to standby posts. Good, I said. Move faster. Williams hovered nearby. Ma'am. I read about you in OCS. The Ghazni run. You flew back in for casualties even after the medevacs pulled out. They said you refused to leave the perimeter until every wounded was accounted for. I gave him a glance. They left out the part where I disobeyed orders. Williams didn't smile. He didn't blink. That's the part that mattered most. Behind us, the mess hall was slowly clearing. A few of the junior officers still lingered near the exit, stealing glances like they couldn't reconcile the apron with the rank. A few enlisted staff stood silently along the wall watching. Denton didn't move. He remained planted at the center table, jaw set, eyes narrowed, not in defiance, but disbelief. His world had bent at an angle he couldn't follow. I'd like to speak with you, he finally said. Privately. Later, I said, still working. Right now, your chain of command is suspended pending further review. I've been embedded here for 14 days under directive from Joint Command. His lips parted as if to protest, but nothing came out. I knew the look. He was calculating whether resistance would help or hurt. A man who never faced real accountability. Not yet. I didn't look up from the tablet. Colonel, you spent the last year building a culture of exclusion. You dismissed complaints, ignored evaluations, and violated the dignity of both enlisted personnel and civilian contractors. You've been spying, he said sharply. I met his eyes. I've been listening. He stood up too fast, knocking his chair back. This is... Sit down, I said, calm as water. He sat. I turned back to Williams. Major, please escort Colonel Denton to Building 7. Tell Captain Hall to begin a full procedural review. Yes, ma'am. And Major, I added, until further notice, you're acting base commander. Williams blinked, stunned, then nodded. Understood. I stepped past them, leaving the mess hall behind. Outside, the late morning sun hit my face like truth. It was the kind of light you only noticed after hiding too long. Each step toward the command center felt like threading back into my skin. This base was supposed to be routine, a quiet observation, a chance to hear what didn't show up in reports. But there was no such thing as quiet when dignity was being stripped in broad daylight. I reached the central office. The young corporal behind the desk snapped up straight when he saw me. General Harper. At ease. He handed over a sealed case file without a word. I took it, walked to the briefing room, and sat alone with the data. 3 civilian staff had resigned in the last 6 months, 2 women, 1 Filipino-American man. Exit interviews flagged, toxic command climate, disrespect, and dismissal of concerns. The same language echoed in junior officer surveys, quietly buried under Denton's sanitized summaries. It was all there. Written softly, ignored loudly. At the bottom of one file, a handwritten note. I just wish someone important would actually see us. I closed the folder. The command room remained quiet long after I had finished reading. I left the file closed on the table. There was no need to reread it. Every word was already etched into memory. It wasn't the overt cruelty that struck hardest, it was the quiet erosion of worth. A pattern I'd seen before in places too far away to name and too close to forget. By 1600 hours, word had traveled across the base. Not officially. Not through a memo or an announcement. But through glances, whispers, posture. By then I had resumed civilian attire, white pants, navy apron, and returned to the cafeteria. I refilled coffee. Cleared trays. No one said anything. But this time they saw me. Not just the general. Not just the name in a dossier. They saw the woman who had listened while they overlooked, who had endured the very culture they'd helped shape, and who now had the power to hold it accountable. That night, I sat alone in the commissary kitchen, watching the steam rise from a chipped mug. The staff had gone home. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed in silence. I thought of the early years' first assignment in Ramadi, convoy routes through Kandahar, the ghosted valley west of Bagram where we buried too many names with too few ceremonies. And I thought of the mornings here. How Denton's voice carried, confident, rehearsed, dripping condescension when he thought no one important was listening. He never once asked me my name. Not once. The next day, the official review began. Captain Hall arrived before dawn, unrolling binders like surgical instruments. Interviews started promptly at 0700. Staff filed in quietly, junior officers, kitchen workers, contract nurses, logistics personnel. One by one, they told their stories. Some careful. Some clipped. A few brimming with exhaustion. By noon it was clear, this wasn't a few bad days. This was culture. Engineered, reinforced, tolerated. Colonel Denton remained under restricted supervision in Building 7. His office was sealed. His command laptop had been submitted to internal review. I watched the process unfold without spectacle, only precision. At 1500 I requested one final interview. Williams met me outside the observation room. He's waiting, ma'am. I nodded. You've handled this well. He looked uncertain. I didn't see it. All this time I didn't speak up. You saw pieces, I said. You just didn't know what they meant. He opened the door and I stepped inside. Denton sat at the far side of the table. His uniform, though pressed, seemed to hang less confidently than before. He didn't stand. You've read the findings? I asked. He nodded once. Do you dispute any part? He looked at me, eyes hard. You've already made up your mind. I didn't have to, I said. Your record did that for you. Silence stretched between us. Then he leaned forward, hands folded. Why did you come here dressed like that? To see what leadership looks like when it thinks no one's watching. He scoffed. You came to trap me. I tilted my head. No. I came to understand the ground truth. And you showed it to me. Every day. His expression faltered, just for a moment. You knew enough to perform when it counted, I said. But not enough to lead when no one clapped. He looked down. I've led men into combat. Earned 2 bronze stars. I don't need lessons from a woman hiding behind an apron. I stood slowly. You've earned medals. Not respect. That's why you're here. As I turned to leave, he asked the question I knew would come. What happens now? I paused at the door. You'll be reassigned under my command. Your first task is to complete a new curriculum, mandatory for all officers assigned to field leadership roles. He didn't answer. It's called leadership through dignity. I didn't wait for a response. The rollout began within the week. Camp Redding's command structure was reorganized. The culture audits were no longer optional. Civilian contractors who had left were contacted for follow-up interviews. Several were offered new roles, higher pay, greater authority, and official apologies. And the Harper story, as people began calling it, spread like wildfire. It wasn't broadcast. It didn't need to be. It traveled across bases through the things that matter most. Whispered conversations in barracks, stories told after shift changes, a quiet nod from a private to a commander they hadn't trusted until now. Williams, now promoted and transferred, later told me it had changed how he saw the uniform itself. I used to think rank meant speaking louder, he said. Now I know it means listening more. I didn't return to Camp Redding. I never do once the work is finished. But I left something behind, something they couldn't file away or forget. And in the Pentagon offices months later, when my name was called and that 4th star was pinned to my shoulder, I thought not of the ceremony, or the applause or the citations. I thought of a hand scraping a coffee pot clean in a forgotten kitchen and how leadership, real leadership, starts in silence. The day the Department of Defense finalized the new leadership directive, I was already at another base. Anonymous again. Apron pressed, sleeves rolled. Another dining hall. Another group of voices that spoke too freely when they thought no one heard. But back at Camp Redding, the change had already taken hold. The new course, Leadership Through Dignity, wasn't just a seminar. It was immersion. Every officer from the rank of captain upward was required to spend a full rotation embedded with the very people they once overlooked. Logistics staff, custodians, food service, civilian techs, even janitorial contractors. No insignias. No salutes. Just shared labor. A mandatory week in humility. Denton arrived at the first session with folded arms and narrowed eyes. He didn't speak much during those days, and when he did, it was clipped. But he completed the week. Mopped the floors. Cleaned the grease traps. Ran supply runs. He watched a young private carry her weight in silence while the kitchen supervisor thanked her every morning by name. By the 4th day, he asked if he could stay an extra hour. By the end of the week, he wasn't speaking much at all, but something in his face had changed. When his final report came across my desk, I noticed he'd written only one paragraph. It read, "I saw more courage behind a counter than I ever did behind a podium. And for the first time, I knew what kind of leader I wasn't. Thank you for not letting me stay that way." I made no note on the file. I simply signed the completion form and moved on. 1 month later, a young cadet stood at the podium during a commissioning ceremony at West Point. His speech was short, raw, and without polish. But his final line spread faster than any prepared remarks ever could. He said, "My father used to tell me leadership is measured by medals." But he was wrong. Last year, I served under a woman named Evelyn Harper. She wore no stripes when I met her. No rank on her chest. But she taught me what dignity looked like under pressure. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to remind us who she was. We remembered because she listened before she spoke. The clip went viral within military circles. Not because of his delivery, but because in the back row, one of the generals stood silently at attention the moment her name was spoken. They all followed. Months later, I found myself walking down a quiet hallway in D.C. The Pentagon's interior was always colder than it needed to be, polished and precise, like it feared its own memory. A junior officer approached, barely out of his academy years. "General Harper?" I paused. "Yes." He straightened. Nervous. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't think you'd answer." I waited. I read about Camp Redding, and the Ghazni op, and the evacuation in Kunduz. I just wanted to say, thank you. I've started listening more. It makes a difference. His voice faltered slightly, but he didn't back away. I'm seeing things I didn't want to see before. I'm asking questions I never asked. And my team talks more now. I think they trust me. I nodded. Then you've already started leading. He smiled, nodded, and disappeared around the corner. In October, I stood at a memorial wall at Fort Benning. No cameras. No speech. I came alone. There were names on that wall that never made the news. Medics who refused to leave a blast zone. Engineers who crossed bridges after they collapsed. An interpreter who shielded a child with her body. Their names were always smaller, always buried beneath acronyms and footnotes. but they carried the weight of wars most never saw. I traced a finger across the edge of the plaque and remembered the silence after the Ghazni convoy ambush. How the dust had swallowed the screams. How I'd crawled through wreckage to find the final survivor, his chest rising in ragged bursts, eyes full of disbelief. "You came back," he had said. "I never left," I told him. That night returned often. Not for its violence, but for what followed, the quiet of carrying someone else's weight because no one else would. Sometimes leadership means command. Sometimes it means orders. But the kind that lasts, the kind that earns respect long after the salute is gone, is the kind that moves through kitchens, hallways, forgotten spaces, where dignity is invisible, until you make it known. By early spring, the Harper Doctrine, as it came to be called informally, was no longer just a policy. It was a movement. Military academies began incorporating silent rotations into their curriculum. 1 week, every semester. No titles. No command. Just presence in kitchens, maintenance bays, hospital wings, and mailrooms. Young cadets scrubbed floors beside Vietnam veterans. They cleaned stretchers under the watch of trauma nurses who had survived 3 deployments. They listened. At first, many bristled. Some wrote anonymous complaints, but others wrote essays that were quietly passed along to command. One read, "I've studied strategy for 4 years. I knew how to flank, how to outmaneuver, how to control terrain. But this week I learned how to look someone in the eye and ask what they needed. And mean it." General Harper said rank isn't a voice, it's a responsibility. I think I finally understand. I read every letter. Most I didn't answer. Some didn't need answers. They just needed to be heard. On a Monday in May, I returned to the Pentagon for what was supposed to be routine, a final roundtable on base leadership reform. The conference room was wide and sterile, a wall of glass on one side, the Capitol gleaming faintly beyond. Admirals, generals, undersecretaries. Too many suits. Too few questions. They asked me to summarize what I'd learned in 28 years. I said this. I've walked through fields of fire and halls of power. I've watched men die with names unspoken and watched promotions handed out with voices too loud. If you want to know how to lead, find the person no one thanks. Watch how they move. How they keep systems running when no one looks up. Then ask them what they need. And actually listen. There was a long silence after I finished. No applause. Just quiet. I liked that better. A few months later, I received a letter. Handwritten. Blue ink. Careful script. It was from a former mess hall attendant at Camp Redding. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. Not for what you did, but for how you did it. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't call attention to yourself. You stood where we stand and let us be heard. Since you left, people treat us differently. Officers know our names now. They ask about our kids. Last week, someone offered me a seat in the officers' lounge. I didn't take it, but I appreciated the offer. You taught me that silence doesn't mean invisibility. It can mean respect. Thank you for reminding me I matter." I folded the letter and kept it in my coat pocket for weeks. Then came the ceremony. It wasn't supposed to be elaborate. I requested it be small. Just enough room for the people who had walked the quietest paths. They didn't listen. The rotunda at the Pentagon was full. Seats lined in perfect formation. Rows of cadets in press dress uniforms. Civilian staff from installations across the country. A handful of old faces, Williams, Hall, even Denton, who stood near the back, still and silent. They pinned the 4th star on my shoulder with ceremonial gravity. Cameras clicked. The press was outside. But I only looked toward the 2nd row. A young girl sat there, 15 maybe. Straight-backed. Clear-eyed. A veteran beside her whispered something and she nodded slowly. That was enough. When it came time for me to speak, I stepped forward with the same calm I had used to deliver casualty reports, evacuation routes, and ceasefire orders. I said, "Leadership is not measured by volume or visibility. It is measured by the way we treat people who cannot advance us, people who work in silence and leave no mark but their contribution. When you forget those people, you lose more than morale. You lose your soul." I wore an apron so you could see yourselves. Not your chain of command. Not your rank. Yourselves. I don't need applause. I need you to remember what matters when no one's watching. There was no standing ovation. Only stillness. And then the softest sound, like a whisper carried on old breath. A veteran in the far corner, shoulders bent with age, turned to the girl beside him and said, "She changed the rules without ever raising her voice." In the days after the ceremony, I disappeared the way I always had. No fanfare. No media tour. Just a transfer request quietly approved and processed. I took a small room at the Joint Command Residential Quarters in Virginia, overlooking a rusted service road and a grove of half-sick elms. I liked it. It was unremarkable. Honest. From there, I reviewed policy drafts. Signed off on updates to the Dignity Initiative. Traveled base to base, never in dress blues. I stayed in motion not because I had to, but because motion was where I could still see the truth. Some places changed quickly. Others resisted. At one base in Arizona, an enlisted specialist pulled me aside during a midnight walkthrough. "You're her," he said. "The one from Camp Redding. The coffee general." I smiled faintly. That's one name for it. They don't yell at us anymore. Not like before. There's still pressure, but it's different. He hesitated, then added, "One of the officers said he scrubbed grease traps for a week and started calling us his team instead of his staff." Progress. Small. Sufficient. Not all feedback was kind. Some senior officials resented the shift. A brigadier general in California asked me during a closed session if I thought the military was becoming too soft. "Doesn't war require hierarchy?" he asked, voice edged with challenge. I answered plainly. "It requires honor. Hierarchy without dignity is just control." He didn't respond. One afternoon, while passing through an old base in Louisiana, I stopped at a chapel. No one else was there. The room smelled of old varnish and wax. The pews were polished by memory. I sat in the back and folded my hands, not in prayer exactly, just reflection. A photo hung near the altar. Faded. A field hospital from the early days of the Iraq War. A nurse, 2 wounded privates, and a captain I once carried through 2 kilometers of sand and shrapnel. He had died 3 days later. I remembered his eyes. Not from the pain. From the way he thanked me, soft, desperate, and full of disbelief that someone had come back. That's what it had always been. Coming back. Again and again. 4 people who were forgotten too easily. In July, I visited a logistics base outside Minneapolis. It wasn't on the schedule. No motorcade. No escort. I arrived mid-shift. Asked to work the loading docks. The supervisor looked confused, then nodded, wordlessly handing me a pair of gloves. For hours later, a young woman, early 20s, lean frame, arms inked with stories, offered me a bottle of water and asked, "Why do you come to places like this?" I thought for a moment. To remind people that rank doesn't excuse you from being human. She took a drink, then smiled. Most brass forget that. Then they were never leading, I said. By autumn, the curriculum at officer schools had changed again. Now the first week of training included time spent shadowing civilian teams. The last week, they wrote what they had learned, not about command, but about quiet leadership. I read the top 20 essays each cycle. Most were filled with textbook gratitude. But one stopped me. It began. I used to think service meant giving orders. Now I think it means carrying chairs so others can sit. It wasn't the medals. It wasn't the stars. It was the woman who washed dishes after a 14-hour shift and said thank you to the night watch. It was the mechanic who found a way to keep a convoy moving with duct tape and prayer. It was the supply clerk who memorized dietary needs for troops no one else remembered by name. It was everyone who never asked to be noticed. And did the work anyway. I returned to Camp Redding exactly 1 year after that first mess hall morning. No warning. No parade. I walked in during breakfast shift. Same tables. Same stainless steel counters. A few new faces. Major Williams, now full colonel, was in uniform, but he spotted me instantly. "General," he said, standing upright. I held up a hand. "Not here. Just Evelyn." He paused. Then nodded. "Welcome back, Evelyn." He introduced me to the new mess chief. The air felt lighter. The room quieter. But not from fear, from something like respect. Before I left, I passed the wall near the entrance. There was a framed photo. Grainy Lorez. Someone had captured the moment just after I answered the Pentagon call. Me in an apron, coffee pot half raised, tablet in the other hand. Beneath it, a small plaque. Dignity doesn't wear rank. It shows up anyway. The invitation arrived in winter. Formal Pentagon stationery. Embossed seal. A single line beneath my name. Ceremony of Commendation and Legacy Address, Hall of Leaders, February 12th. I hesitated before replying. I didn't want another speech. I didn't need a final honor. But it wasn't about me. It was for them, the quiet ones. The overlooked. The ones who taught me everything without knowing they were teachers. So I went. The Hall of Leaders was full. Not just generals and secretaries, but the cafeteria workers from Camp Redding, the janitor from Fort Kennard who always whistled Bach, the logistics tech from Bagram who taught herself Urdu to help local translators feel seen. They were all there. I stood behind the podium, my last address, and said only this. Leadership means never assuming the value of a person based on their uniform, or lack of one. True rank lies in how you treat others when no one's watching. Then I stepped back. No applause. Just a silence that meant it had landed where it needed to. In the audience, a young soldier leaned forward and whispered to his daughter. She changed the rules without ever raising her voice.